It happened before, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A single decision, one man, one office, one signature. And within a decade, the people who understood what was coming walked away wealthier than they ever imagined. While everyone else, the savers, the safe investors, the ones who trusted the system, watched their life savings quietly disappear. Now, in 2026, the same pattern is forming again, the same pressure, the same names, the same warning signs. So the question is simple. Are you going to be ready this time? Welcome back to Golden Crest Finance. And if this is your first time joining us, thank you for being here. We know your time is valuable, and we don't take it for granted. Wherever you're watching from today, whether that's the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, or somewhere else entirely, we'd love for you to share your city in the comments below. It always means a lot to see this community from all over the world. If you find value in what we cover here, consider becoming part of our channel family by subscribing. It helps us continue bringing you clear, honest financial analysis you can trust. Now, let's walk through this story together. To understand what is happening today, viewers need to travel back to the year 1971. That is when this story truly begins. At that time, Richard Nixon was president of the United States. He was preparing for a tough re-election campaign in 1972. The economy was slow, unemployment was high, and Nixon knew something very simple. No president wins an election during hard economic times, but Nixon had a problem. He did not control the nation's money supply. That power belonged to the Federal Reserve, an institution designed to operate independently, free from political pressure. So Nixon made a bold move. He appointed his own choice as Federal Reserve Chairman, a man named Arthur Burns. At first, this may sound like a simple appointment, but what happened next was anything but simple. According to records later revealed on the White House tapes, Nixon and his team applied intense pressure on Burns. They allegedly leaked negative stories about him to the press when he resisted lowering interest rates. They reportedly threatened to add more Fed board members who would vote against him if he did not cooperate. Eventually, Burns gave in. He began cutting interest rates, even though inflation was already a serious concern. In 1969, interest rates in the U.S. were near 9%. By early 1972, Burns had lowered them to around 3.5%. Money became cheap. It flowed easily through the economy. Businesses expanded. Consumers spent more. On the surface, everything looked strong. The strategy worked politically. Nixon won 49 out of 50 states in the 1972 election, one of the largest landslides in American history. But economists say the bill for that short-term boost eventually came due. And it came due hard. By 1974, inflation had climbed from about 3% to over 12%. Then, in late 1973, an oil embargo hit the world economy. Oil prices roughly quadrupled within months. This added even more pressure onto an economy that was already overheating from years of loose monetary policy. The result was a decade many economists now describe as one of the most painful periods for everyday savers in modern American history. Stock markets suffered badly. Between January 1973 and late 1974, the S&P 500 lost close to 45% of its value. It did not bounce back quickly. Instead, it moved sideways for years, while the cost of living kept rising. People who held their savings in popular stocks of that era, companies once seen as completely safe, nicknamed the Nifty 50, watched many of those companies lose 80 to 90% of their value. Some, like Polaroid, never fully recovered and eventually went bankrupt decades later. Meanwhile, something very different was happening in another part of the economy. Gold, which had been fixed by law at just $35 an ounce for decades, was finally allowed to trade freely. By January 1980, its price had soared to $850 an ounce. Silver, farmland, oil, and other real assets also surged in value throughout the 1970s. American farmland alone roughly tripled in price during that decade. In short, two very different outcomes unfolded side by side. Those holding cash, bonds, and many popular stocks quietly lost purchasing power, even if their account balances looked unchanged. Meanwhile, those holding gold, silver, and other tangible assets saw significant gains. Financial historians often point to this period as a clear lesson about what can happen when a central bank comes under political pressure to prioritize short-term growth over long-term stability. Today, in 2026, many analysts say the early signs of a similar pattern are forming again. A new administration applying public pressure on the Federal Reserve, a newly appointed Fed chairman, and rising concerns about inflation returning. Fast forward to today, and a new chapter of this story is unfolding in real time. In July 2026, the United States finds itself facing an economic moment that many analysts describe as strikingly familiar. A newly appointed Federal Reserve Chairman, Kevin Warsh, has stepped into the role after being handpicked to lead the central bank. From his very first public appearance, Warsh made his position clear. During his Senate confirmation process, he stated that he prefers to look at what economists call trimmed average inflation measures. For viewers unfamiliar with this term, it simply means a method of calculating inflation that removes certain extreme price swings from the data. The highest and lowest changes are trimmed away before the average is calculated. Supporters say this approach helps smooth out temporary shocks, like a sudden spike in gasoline prices, so policymakers can see the broader trend more clearly. Critics, however, argue that this method can sometimes make inflation appear lower than what everyday households are actually experiencing at the grocery store or gas pump. In his first official meeting as chairman, Warsh made an unexpected move. He removed language from the Fed's official statement that had previously hinted at upcoming interest rate cuts. Instead, he suggested that rate increases could still be on the table if inflation data required it. Financial markets reacted quickly. Gold prices dropped in response as investors adjusted their expectations for a tighter monetary policy going forward. However, just days later, new economic data shifted the conversation once again. On the first Friday of July, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics released its monthly jobs report. The numbers were weaker than expected. The economy added only 57,000 new jobs, far below the 110,000 that economists had forecast. In addition, the agency revised the previous 2 months' job figures downward by a combined 74,000 positions. This means the labor market had actually been weaker than originally reported. One sector was hit particularly hard. According to the report, the leisure and hospitality industry alone lost 61,000 jobs in June. Despite this, the national unemployment rate remained relatively stable at 4.2%, which analysts say is why widespread public concern has not yet emerged. Still, financial markets took notice. Following the release of this data, gold prices recorded their first weekly gain in more than a month. Analysts widely interpreted this move as a signal that large institutional investors were beginning to anticipate a shift in Federal Reserve policy, possibly toward future interest rate cuts, especially if labor market weakness continues. At the same time, official statements from Fed representatives have stressed patience. Public commentary from central bank officials indicates that no immediate policy change is expected in the coming weeks. Many economists believe the Fed will likely wait to gather more data before making any significant decisions, particularly with U.S. midterm elections approaching later this year. It is worth noting that current conditions differ from those in the 1970s in some important ways. Back then, inflation was largely driven by an oil price shock, when oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. Today, oil prices tell a very different story. Brent crude, one of the world's key oil benchmarks, peaked near $126 per barrel in April 2026 during a period of geopolitical tension, but has since fallen to around $71 per barrel. Some market forecasts even suggest prices could drop closer to $60 by the end of the year. This means today's inflation pressures are being driven by different forces, particularly new tariff policies, rather than an oil crisis like the one seen in the 1970s. As these developments continue to unfold, analysts say the coming months will be critical. The decisions made by Chairman Warsh, combined with future economic data releases, are expected to shape the direction of interest rates, inflation, and ultimately the value of the U.S. dollar. Every major shift in monetary policy carries consequences, and history shows those consequences rarely affect everyone equally. Understanding this matters because the choices made in Washington today could shape household finances for years to come. For everyday savers, the most immediate concern involves interest rates and inflation working against each other. When a central bank lowers interest rates while inflation remains elevated, the money sitting in a typical savings account can lose purchasing power over time. A saver might see their account balance stay the same or grow slightly, yet find that same amount of money buys noticeably less at the grocery store or gas station a year later. Financial experts refer to this as a decline in real value, even when the numbers on a bank statement appear unchanged. This pattern played out significantly during the 1970s. Many people who kept their money in cash, government bonds, or popular stocks did nothing wrong by the financial standards of their time. They followed conventional advice, yet by the end of that decade, many discovered their savings could purchase far less than before, even though their account balances looked similar. Financial historians often describe this as one of the most damaging periods for conservative savers in modern American history. On the other side of the equation, those holding tangible assets, such as gold, silver, farmland, and certain commodities, generally fared very differently during that same period. Analysts point out that this divide was not necessarily due to superior financial knowledge. In many cases, people who benefited simply held real assets before the economic shift occurred, rather than reacting to it after the fact. Today, similar dynamics are being closely watched. If the Federal Reserve moves toward interest rate cuts while inflation remains a concern, some economists warn that a comparable pattern could emerge, though the scale and speed may differ from the 1970s due to today's more complex, interconnected global economy. There are also broader economic implications beyond individual savings. Lower interest rates can make borrowing cheaper, which may encourage business investment and consumer spending in the short term. This can support job growth and economic activity. However, if inflation is not carefully managed alongside these lower rates, the long-term effect can be a steady erosion of the dollar's purchasing power, impacting everything from everyday grocery bills to long-term retirement planning. It's also important to present a balanced view. Not all economists agree on how this situation will unfold. Some analysts argue that today's Federal Reserve, along with modern tools for monitoring inflation, is far better equipped to prevent the kind of extended inflation seen in the 1970s. They point to differences such as today's lower oil prices, more diversified global supply chains, and improved central bank communication strategies as reasons this moment may not fully repeat history. Others take a more cautious view. They note that public pressure on a central bank, regardless of the era, can create risks when short-term political goals conflict with long-term economic stability. These analysts argue that once market confidence in a central bank's independence is questioned, the effects can be difficult to reverse quickly. There's also a social dimension to this story. Retirees living on fixed incomes, individuals relying on pensions, and everyday families saving for future goals often feel the effects of inflation more directly than large institutional investors, who typically have more tools available to adjust their strategies. This is why many financial educators stress the importance of understanding these broader economic shifts, rather than only focusing on daily market headlines. Ultimately, the consequences of this unfolding situation extend far beyond financial markets. They touch everyday decisions, how families budget, how retirees plan their spending, and how younger generations think about saving for the future. As this story continues to develop, many questions remain unanswered. Viewers may find themselves wondering how long the current Federal Reserve leadership will hold its position on interest rates, and whether upcoming economic data will change that approach in the months ahead. Financial analysts are closely watching several key dates and events in the near future. The next major jobs report is expected in early August, and many economists believe this data could significantly influence the Federal Reserve's next move. If job growth remains weak, some analysts suggest pressure may build for interest rate cuts sooner rather than later. If job numbers improve, the current cautious approach may continue for a longer period. Midterm elections later this year are also seen as an important factor. Historically, political timelines can influence the pace and timing of major economic decisions, though officials at the Federal Reserve maintain that their choices are based strictly on economic data rather than political considerations. Inflation reports will also remain under close watch. Since Chairman Warsh has indicated a preference for trimmed average inflation measures, comparing these figures to more traditional inflation measurements may offer viewers a clearer picture of how price pressures are truly affecting households across the country. For viewers wanting to stay informed, financial experts generally recommend following official sources directly. The Federal Reserve publishes statements and meeting minutes on its website. The Bureau of Labor Statistics releases monthly employment and inflation data that is publicly available and free to access. Reading these primary sources, rather than relying solely on headlines, can help individuals form a clearer, more balanced understanding of the economic situation as it unfolds. It's also worth remembering that no single video, article, or analyst can predict the future with certainty. Financial markets are influenced by countless factors, many of which are difficult to foresee. This is why financial educators often encourage viewers to focus on understanding patterns and principles, rather than searching for guaranteed predictions. History does not always repeat itself in exactly the same way, but many analysts agree that it often rhymes. The 1970s offered a clear lesson about what can happen when political pressure meets a central bank's decision-making process. Whether today's situation follows a similar path, takes a different direction, or lands somewhere in between remains to be seen. What matters most for everyday viewers is staying informed, asking thoughtful questions, and understanding how these large economic decisions can eventually reach into personal finances, from savings accounts to retirement planning to everyday spending power. So here are a few questions worth reflecting on. How might a shift in Federal Reserve policy affect your own savings or financial plans? Do you believe today's economic tools and global conditions are different enough to prevent a repeat of the 1970s? And how closely do you think political pressure should be allowed to influence a central bank's decisions? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations help build a more informed community, and hearing different perspectives is part of what makes this space valuable. Before wrapping up, if this video helped explain a complex topic in a clear and balanced way, consider subscribing to Golden Crest Finance for future updates as this story continues to unfold. New developments are expected in the weeks ahead, and staying informed early often makes the biggest difference. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to understand this story in depth. Golden Crest Finance will continue tracking these developments closely, bringing clear, balanced updates as this important economic story continues to unfold.